All right, so a lot of the Bernie support is obviously mixed with the Black Lives Matter support. And, you know, one of the things I've been saying about the Black Lives Matter movement is their intentions are good, and somehow what's happened to the movement seems to have been hijacked or derailed by, I think, what you would call far leftists. Do you agree with that, or do you think the movement was always that way? Where do you see it now? Where do you see it going?
Well, I mean, back in 2013, 2014, myself and Infowars were on the forefront of exposing police brutality. I mean, probably 25% of my content every day was about police brutality. Now that that whole narrative has been hijacked by Black Lives Matter, it makes you less enthusiastic to actually talk about police brutality. The effect that they've had, and the polls show this, is massive support for police departments across the United States, because the tactics that they engage in are so divisive and turn ordinary Americans off to such a degree that now a lot of people simply would immediately support the police, even in a flagrant case of police brutality. So, you know, you have to go back to the founding of Black Lives Matter. Obviously, a lot of well-meaning people jumped on board in the first 6 months or so. But the inspiration behind Black Lives Matter, and this is the woman that the 3 female founders of that embryonic group said was their inspiration, was a woman named Assata Shakur. Now, she's on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list because she killed a cop in New Jersey back in the 70s and then fled to Cuba. This is a woman who's, you know, Black Lives Matter activists, they invoke her name at nearly every rally. She's a domestic terrorist who left the Black Panther Party because it wasn't violent enough. She joined the Black Liberation Army. You know, this was another domestic terror group that was involved in bombings and assassinations, killing police officers. So when you have that kind of guru, that inspiration behind a movement, obviously it's going to tend towards violence. You had Black Lives Matter protesters in New York walking down the street chanting, "What do we want? Dead cops. When do we want them now?" That's only going to turn people away from your movement. So it's not an inclusive movement. It's been a divisive movement since almost the beginning, since just after the first Ferguson protests, and it's only got worse as it's been hijacked by all these opportunists and operatives.
Yeah, so for you, as you said, you guys were ahead on this stuff, and I remember seeing a lot of videos that you guys were doing where you were talking about police brutality before it had really bubbled up into the mainstream news. So it must be extremely depressing for you as someone that like is in this and you talk about this. You understand that there was something good here, and as you just laid out, that it has been derailed. How do you get it back to that? Is it too late? Is the wave already gone to get it back to what was right, dealing with legit issues about police brutality?
Well, when the entire movement, you know, BLM was founded on this Michael Brown case, the whole hands up, don't shoot myth, and the media peddled that for what, 6 months or more? The autopsy, of course, it turned out that was complete BS. He never had his hands up. So they base all their grievances on these completely fraudulent cases. And then you have a case like Eric Garner, which was a legitimate act of police brutality, which, you know, we supported the victim in that case. But they tend to base all their grievances on these ridiculous cases that are obviously justified use of force by the police. So it's difficult to see how we're going to get back to a rational conversation about it when these people are, you know, invoking the inspiration, the guru of a domestic terrorist. They're chanting for dead cops. You know, you had people plan to bomb the Ferguson police station. You had the cops that were killed in New York as part of a Black Lives Matter revenge attack by Ishmael Brinsley. So when it attracts those kind of extremists, I mean, at this point, I call it a domestic hate group. If this was a bunch of white Oregon militia members who were, you know, chanting for black cops to be killed or black people to be killed, who some of them were actually planning to do that, and whose ideological inspiration was Timothy McVeigh, for example, the media wouldn't get behind that. But we've seen elements of the media get behind Black Lives Matter. We've seen, you know, Time magazine in defense of rioting. So they built this whole grievance industry. It was supported by some elements of the leftist media. And now you've got Hillary Clinton meeting with Black Lives leaders back a few months ago saying she's prepared to change laws for them. I think this is a very, divisive, destructive movement, and it's delegitimized genuine opposition to police brutality, which was an issue and continues to be an issue. But now people are so turned off towards that. As I said, the polls show that people don't like Black Lives Matter. They're now more likely to support police.
Yeah, a perfect example of that would be sort of what you alluded to, which is what happened in Oregon here, 2 months ago, when, the Clive and Bundy people, they took over basically a vacant, house, office, and I saw all of my progressive friends were screaming about what terrorists they are, domestic terrorists. I'm not defending them. They walked into a federal building, even if nobody was there and the door was unlocked, with weapons, and I think maybe one person did die somehow related to it or something. You could correct me if I'm wrong on that. But there was such outrage over that, where there was virtually no violence, not defending everything that they did, versus the lack of outrage when there's actual violence. So everything comes down to race at the end of the day with the progressives, right?
Well, yeah, there was a young guy holed up there in the wildlife center right at the end of that situation who was threatening to kill himself, and it was being broadcast live on the internet. It was a tragic situation, but on Twitter you had all the regressives celebrating it, calling him a racist and saying he should shoot himself in the head. You had Lavoy Finicum, who was in the vehicle, with a couple of these other protesters, females, traveling through this FBI roadblock. He gets out of the car. He gets gunned down, God knows, 24 times or whatever. That was a shady situation. But again, as you said, a complete lack of outrage. They filled the car with bullets. It's a surprise that these are the women who were unarmed and were not showing any resistance, didn't get slaughtered themselves. But on the left, there was no outrage whatsoever because they weren't black. I think we should treat everybody who's a victim of police brutality the same, regardless of race. But because they don't do that, it turns, white middle-class America away from their movement, and it prevents us from becoming truly united in addressing police brutality.
Yeah, I mean, that's it right there. Their unintended consequences of what they do actually drive people the other way. What would you say to, I have progressive friends, most of them won't talk to me anymore, but I had progressive friends that when we discuss this stuff, they would say, well, a certain amount of violence, if you really want social change, a certain amount of violence is necessary. Do you buy that at all, or do you think that's just an excuse? Because look, you're not going to get headlines if there isn't a certain amount of violence, right? If you just have peaceful protests, the media doesn't show up.
Well, I believe in non-violent civil disobedience. I mean, if you look at everyone throughout history who's actually changed society, if you look at, Gandhi or Martin Luther King, who now the progressives are trying to disavow because he wasn't inclusive of transgender people, then they don't need to resort to violence because their cause is powerful enough. When people become a threat to the establishment when they unite black people, when they unite white people, when they unite people from different political persuasions. They don't become a threat when they resort to violence because they can be easily demonized and dealt with by the state. So no, I think that's a terrible idea. I think it's going to be unsuccessful.
Yeah, and it's also directly linked into why these regressives, and now we can get into the regressives. Somehow we did 45 minutes, we barely said the word regressive, why they label everyone, you, me, everybody else, as bigots and racists and everything else, because they can't control people without splitting us all down into the little racial markers, or this one's oppressed more than as somebody keeps saying, the oppression Olympics, basically. So let's talk about the regressives. Was your wake up to them at the exact same time as you sort of woke up to the social justice warrior stuff, or did it come a little bit after that when you really saw that there was this group of people that was protecting and pushing this ideology?
Well, it probably correlated, with the rise of ISIS, with these terrorist attacks in Europe, with the migrant crisis and the fact that we're importing people from bad cultures. And I mean, that's the heart of regressivism. It's self-proclaimed liberals who defend and tolerate non-liberal ideologies. And I think because at their heart, they're cultural relativists, right? They believe that all cultures are equal. Well, I don't believe that. I think there are bad cultures and good cultures. I made a video a few days ago. Some cultures are better than others. But at the heart of progressivism is this idea of utopianism. So there can't be such a thing as a bad culture. Accepting the fact that there are bad cultures demolishes utopianism. So that's why progressives, so-called progressives, can't entertain the fact that there are bad cultures even for a second, even though they blatantly are. I mean, you know, when US troops blew the whistle on how Afghan police officers were bringing young boys onto the army base and raping them, and they were told to shut up about it because that was, quote, part of their culture, I think that's a bad culture. You know, when UNICEF has to do PR campaigns to educate 600 million Indians, half of their population, not to defecate in the street because it's, you know, causing deadly infections and child malnutrition, that's a bad culture. We need to call out bad cultures because I don't think importing them into the West is compatible with Western ideals of, you know, liberal tolerance. But the regressives can't entertain that for a second because they're cultural relativists. They can't entertain the notion that some cultures are better than others, which is why in Germany, for example, these migrants that came in and, you know, started defecating in hot tubs, started masturbating in swimming pools, started raping children in swimming pools. One of the swimming pools in Germany responded by banning male migrants. Yeah. How did the regressive left respond to that? They complained. They said it was racist. They intimidated. They forced the swimming pool into lifting the ban. Because again, they can't entertain the notion that some cultures are worse than others. And that's the heart of, you know, regressives. It's this utopian idea that everybody's the same and everybody's equal, even though this is bad behavior that we shouldn't be accepting and embracing in the West.
Yeah, and there's really no end to it, right? That's why this snake will eventually eat its tail. Because, you know, if you look what happened in Germany, you know, right on New Year's with all the rapes and all the sexual attacks on women, suddenly all the regressives were defending basically the perpetrators. They kept saying, not all Muslims, all this stuff. Nobody was saying all Muslims. People were saying the specific people here who did this, they have these set of values. They're the ones that did it. That's what a rational person would say. We didn't say this is condemning every single person that believes in this, and yet they go to defend that, so they throw women under the bus. So it's like they have their pecking order, and in this case, women came below the migrants because the migrants are mostly Muslim.
Yeah, it's that whole oppression Olympics idea. And, you know, when it came out in Cologne, it later emerged that most of the perpetrators were not newly arrived refugees. They were migrants who had been there for several years. And the regressives celebrated this.
Right, they thought that, yeah.
How dare you demonize the refugees? This was done by migrants. Okay, so migrants who are supposedly assimilated, they've been there for years, and yet this is the kind of behavior they're engaging in. And that's something to celebrate. I mean, that's, again, that shines light on the heart of regressivism. And as he said, you know, after every single terror attack, we hear the same thing again and again. Don't blame Islam. Not all Muslims are terrorists. Nobody ever suggested that. That's never been part of the debate. They try and frame the debate so it becomes that because they can't win when you actually drill down, you know, into the statistics and show that this isn't a tiny minority of people. This is what I bang on about again and again. You know, I make videos saying Islam's not a religion of peace, get death threats as a result of it, I guess, to prove that it is a religion of peace. But I mean, you can look at the statistics. This is not a tiny minority of people. This is a problem within Islam. This is why we need to support the voices of reform within Islam. So Pew had a poll, for example, the percentage of Muslims who think that suicide bombings are justified under some circumstances. They asked Muslims in European countries. So in France, 31% of adult Muslims over the age of 30 think that suicide bombings are sometimes justified. If you look at young people aged 18 to 29, that goes up to 42% think that suicide bombings are sometimes justified. And it's similar in, you know, Spain, 22% of adults think the same. Germany 10%, and 22% of those aged 18 to 29 think that suicide bombings are justified. You've also got huge numbers of Muslims throughout Europe. In France, for example, 27% of Muslims aged 18 to 24 support ISIS. So again, this is not a tiny fringe minority of people. 21% of Syrians support ISIS. These are the people who we're bringing in. So it's this lie that the Islamophobia industry upholds, that it's just a tiny fringe minority. It isn't, and the facts, the stats prove that.
Yeah. What do you think of the word Islamophobia? I assume you're not a fan of the word itself, right? Because it's an imaginary word. You can't fear a set of ideas. You can fear actions that people might do. And Islam itself says a lot of bad things about infidels like the two of us, right? So it's not an irrational fear to fear this set of ideas. This is just a made-up word, right? That doesn't discount that there might be bigotry towards Muslim people, but the word itself is a slippery slope, right?
Well, it's become interchangeable with racist, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, at this point, the Islamophobia industry is bolstered and exaggerated to such an extent. I mean, there are Islamophobic attacks, and they're horrible, and we should decry them. But it's presented.
But those are anti-Muslim attacks, right? Not Islamophobic attacks, right? They're not afraid of the idea of something. They're afraid of the people, right?
Yeah, those are basically racist attacks. But if you look at actual hate crimes, they're far outweighed by anti-Semitic attacks, for example, in most Western countries. So I think that's exaggerated. We saw that again in Molenbeek just the other day, where the media reported that a right-wing protester had run over a Muslim woman. Later turned out that it was a Muslim teen from Molenbeek who ran over the Muslim woman. So there are these fake Islamophobic attacks. There was another one on Wall Street where a Muslim woman says she was slashed across the face in an Islamophobic attack. Turned out it was completely made up. So again, at this point, why not own it? Why not say, yes, I'm afraid of an ideology that supports Sharia law, that supports stoning women to death, executing homosexuals, killing people who leave the faith of Islam. Yes, I'm very afraid of importing those kind of ideas into the West. And when, for example, 50% of Muslims, of American Muslims, support the right to live under Sharia law in the United States, that's a problem. And I'm going to call attention to that figure because it's way too high. And to call attention to that figure is not to be Islamophobic. It's to be rightly concerned about these intolerant beliefs being imported into the West as they now are in such great numbers.
So for people like us that want to have honest discussions about this without bigotry and without hyperbole, and I know it's very hard to do and we don't win any points for doing this really, but for people like us, and I know it's a growing movement, should we start thinking of Islam more as a political ideology than a religion? Because people, no matter how many times we separate ideas versus people, religion versus people can't seem to do it. There's a certain amount of people, they cannot detangle these two things. But I'm starting to think that if we start describing these actions as political actions, killing gays, not good, oppressing women, not good. If these were a political party was pushing these ideas, the left would be completely against it. So is that sort of how we have to, not to give up our tactics publicly right now, but is that how we have to start focusing on this argument?
I think it is, exactly. I mean, Sam Harris, Majid Nawaz, they've outlined the fact that this is not just jihadists. The problem isn't just jihadists. Yes, you can point to that and say that's a tiny minority, but the main problem is Islamists. I agreed with Obama when he said terrorism is not an existential threat. I mean, we're not going to all be killed by terrorists. There's not going to be such a massive, onset of terrorist attacks that it proves an existential threat. But when you import these ideas that are incompatible with Western society, then that's a direct to our quality of life, our culture, and the entire underpinnings of Western society as a free, liberal, tolerant society. So we have to emphasize that distinction, that there are not just jihadists, there are Islamists. I mean, look at Salah Abdeslam there in Molenbeek in Brussels. He was protected for months after the Paris massacre by his friends and neighbors. Okay, they're not jihadists. They haven't gone out and slaughtered anybody, but they were protecting a jihadist because they're Islamists. And this is the problem. When we get huge numbers of people moving into Western societies, they create these ghettos, they create centers of power, and then ISIS comes out in its manifesto and says, we're going to encourage the creation of these ghettos in the West to radicalize these populations to support our cause. Then that's a problem. I mean, you can get an AK-47 on the streets of Molenbeek within a few hours for 400 euros. That doesn't just arise out of jihadists. That's this whole Islamist support network that protects Salah Abdeslam, for example. So that's a distinction we need to emphasize to leftists and regressives. Again, it's not a tiny minority. We have to include Islamists as part of the problem. And if you include them as part of the problem, the figures show that it's a distressing proportion of people who support, advocate, and promote these intolerant beliefs.
Yeah, and I know no matter how many times we repeat the difference between jihadists and Islamists and the average nominal Muslim, somehow that just can't get through to a certain amount of people. But before I let you go, I want to dive into the immigration thing a little deeper, because you've done a lot on it. And when I've watched some of your videos, you know, we really, in the mainstream media in the United States, we barely talk about it. I would guess that if you watch CNN 24 hours today, that you wouldn't see one story on it, literally not 1 minute on it. And then I watch your videos and some other people, and I'll watch some stuff on the BBC or something like that, and I get a sense that it's a big problem. And I get tons of messages, mainly I'm getting a ton of stuff from Sweden especially, talking about this. Would you say out of a 10, where is this thing at right now? I mean, is this really as bad as the videos that you've put out? It makes it sound like there's a massive crisis right now. Or is some of it overblown? Is it different for every country? I'm still struggling to get a hold on it.
Well, it's different for every country. There tends to be a tipping point when a country goes above, for example, 6 to 7% Muslim population. That's when you get the no-go areas, which the media still claims is a conspiracy theory. I got chased out of one in Molenbeek. I can attest to the fact that it's not. So that's the kind of tipping point. I mean, to illustrate this, you can look at the prison populations in these different European countries. So, for example, Belgium, which of course just suffered the Brussels attack, the Muslim population is around 6%, but the prison population of Belgium comprises 45% Muslims.
Wow.
The 45% of the prisoners in Belgium are Muslims, despite the fact they only make up 6% of the population. You look at France, 6 to 10% Muslim population, but the prison population is 70% Muslims. Same in Spain. Muslim population 3.7%. Prison population is 70% Muslim. So obviously something is broken here, and we're seeing the creation of more of these ghettos. They don't assimilate, but our political leaders want to bring them in for their own agenda, which is the goal of importing huge numbers of people from the third world to vote for bigger government. If you look at polls conducted amongst Muslims, they typically support expanded welfare state, and they vote once they become citizens for bigger government. So they've placed Europe's security, they've placed our entire social cohesion under grave danger in favor of advancing this political agenda.
Yeah, do you think it was that in the case of like Angela Merkel, do you think it was that calculated? Like my sense is that there was some level of guilt because of the Holocaust, and Germany still is trying to deal with that they partly were trying to do something good here. They brought this, I think it's 1.2 or 1.3 million people in, and that it is just crushing the system and creating all this resentment. And a country that has a tough history with xenophobia, it's only going to get worse. And it's hard to believe that she knowingly did this, even if it was just to get votes, which it's not working, right? Because didn't some of the right parties just win elections?
No, it was a reaction to that. I mean, for the past couple of years, you've had basically a conservative backlash sweeping Europe. The Euro elections in 2014 proved that. So it was a backlash to that. Now, of course, 500,000 migrants who have come into Germany haven't registered with authorities. So that's going to become a massive problem. But yeah, a lot of it was virtue signaling on steroids, right? So you had, the German Green Party politician, Stephanie von Berg. She got up in front of the German parliament and said, quote, our city will change radically. I hold that in 20, 30 years, there will no longer be a German majority in our city. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So she said that simply as a way of pissing off the right wing in Germany, they would bring in these migrants to displace the German population. So part of it is virtue signaling on steroids. Part of it is that guilt about the Nazis, which of course we have to remember, only a minority of the German population actually supported the Nazi party in the 1930s. So I would argue that why would you punish, German citizens, taxpayers now? We've got Germans being kicked out of social housing to be replaced by migrants. Over 1.2 million migrants brought in already over the past year. And again, politicians celebrating the demographic suicide of their country. And it clearly isn't working, because every single day we have these cases of people being raped. Now, the primary victims of rape are Muslim women and girls in these migrant camps. But now you see these reports of, Afghan migrants raping boys in swimming pools. And quite frankly, I'm sick of seeing it every single day.
Yeah.
This is a bad culture. These people aren't being assimilated. If you import huge numbers of people at breakneck speed with no clear plan on how to assimilate them, there's going to be bedlam. There's going to be chaos. And that's now why top military chiefs in Sweden, in Switzerland, in Norway are warning that this could lead to civil unrest and outright war, basically, if it continues this way.
Yeah, man, I wanted to end with you on a positive note. Can we figure out how to do that? Where's Europe going to be in 10 years? Any hope?
Well, as I said, a lot of these parties are being voted out of power, and that's been happening for the past couple of years. So there is a kind of backlash against it. I'm all for limited, skilled immigration. I think that's healthy for a society. But the way it's going, 300,000 immigrants every year coming into the United Kingdom. We've only got a population of 60 million, and that's the number after the other ones have left. So it's going to become overwhelming. It's going to cause more problems, more riots. But from a positive perspective, my videos, your videos about this are reaching a huge audience because the media continually lies about it. They don't point out that 72% of the people coming in are men. These are generally not families. 4/5 of them at one point weren't even Syrians. But the fact that I can do a video about this and it gets over 1 million views proves that people are thirsty for the truth, and we are shaping the narrative. And eventually, the hope is that that will change government policy by sheer force of pressure.
All right. Well, listen, that's exactly why I try to have these conversations, and that's why I like the work you do. And you know what? Here's what we'll do. For anyone that's watching this that thinks that anything that Paul said was conspiratorial or unfactual, tag me on Twitter with them, and we'll talk some of this stuff out. Will you make that commitment? We'll talk some of this stuff out with a couple of the people, not everybody.
I'll do it.
You'll do it? All right. So it's at Prison Planet on Twitter, and he's doing all these videos on YouTube. And I thank you guys for watching. And Paul, you stayed up late for me, so I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, man.